Ladies and gentlemen, dear partners, speakers, and our guests, I would like to warmly welcome all of you here in Bratislava today, as well as those of you joining us online from across the world for our conference on strategic corruption in context of security. First of all, I would like to give a sincerely thank you to the donor of this project for making this conference possible and for supporting our work in this field. Specifically, our thanks go to German Marshall Fund of the United States and the European Union. Without your support, gatherings like this and the work that we are doing currently creating framework for analysis of strategic corruption would not be possible. Also, thank you very much to the representation of European Commission in Slovakia for hosting us today in their premises. Thank you for our speakers for being here today with us in person and also joining us online as far as from Japan, as you see later, Dr. Požgaj Alvarez. Last but not least, thank you to our colleagues and volunteers in Nest Institute whose work would make this event impossible today, so thank you for all your support. We are meeting today at a time when we can no longer think of the world in simple terms of peace and war. Following the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and Russian invasion of Ukraine, the reality of Europe and the world is far more complex. While not fighting in conventional conflict, we operate on a spectrum somewhere in between war and peace. We are increasingly confronted with hybrid threats. These are not open conflicts, but neither are they true peace. These are gradual, often coordinated processes that erode our institution, weaken trust, and undermine the societies from within. At the same time, it's important to recognize that these activities are not new, nor are they limited to the period following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Various state actors have been developing these tools and strategies for many years in various countries across the world, in long term and in a systematic way. Too often, the hybrid threats are reduced to disinformation, but in reality, they involve a much broader set of tools that are physically visible across the world, including attacks on infrastructure, sabotage activities, drone incursions that are spreading fear and chaos. And beyond these visible actions, there is also a quieter, long-term layer of influence, ones that are less visible but often more impactful. These tools include the manipulation of election processes, erosion of trust in institutions, and polarization of our societies. Among these tools, the particularly important tool is strategic corruption, about which we will be talking today. These soft tools of hybrid warfare can have a profound impact on our security, on our partnerships, and on the unity of European Union and NATO. That's why we must approach these challenges differently, not in isolation, but strategically, and not superficially, but analytically. This is precisely why we speak today about strategic corruption. At the same time, we must acknowledge that the responses to these threats are not always sufficient. We recognize that in some countries, including Slovakia, political will is not always strong to address these challenges, which makes a broad, whole of society approach even more essential. To be more resilient, we need cooperation not only across state institutions, but across academia, civil society, investigative media, and international partners. I am very encouraged to see such a diverse group of stakeholders and partners meeting us today, and it gives me confidence that this topic will not remain on the level of discussion, but we will translate it into practice. Another key challenge in hybrid threats is attribution, the ability to clearly identify who is behind these activities and ideally prove them. While civil society, investigative journalists, and academia, we do not possess any investigative mandate to investigate all these issues, but we play a crucial role in collecting data, connecting the dots, and bringing hidden patterns into light. This makes our role in the civil sector, academia, and journalists even more important. Our goal is to raise awareness, build capacity, and strengthen cooperation, including across the borders. Because if we stop talking about these issues, we create space for them to grow. And this is the risk we cannot afford. I know there is no single silver bullet solution to this problem. Our ambition within our project with German Marshall Fund is to contribute to the piece of puzzle to broader effort to prepare the framework to practically analyze strategic corruption and find common solutions. I believe this would help us to connect and to build networks and to strengthen our ability to detect, understand, and respond to these challenges that strategic corruption poses to our countries. Through this process, it's important to build the more resilient societies and more resilient countries, which is our primary goal. I know that resilience is not built overnight. It's built step by step over long term and together with our partners. Therefore, I'm very thankful that you all are here. I wish you very insightful the conference. And for the beginning, we have a small change in the program because Dr. Hogić was unable to join us in person. So he'll be joining us for the keynote speech and for the first panel online from Oslo. So thank you very much, and please welcome Dr. Hogić from University of Oslo for his keynote speech.
Hi, I hope that you can hear me well. Yeah, so thank you for the wonderful introduction, and I apologize for being unable to attend the conference in person. This is one of the few events organized and dedicated to strategic corruption specifically. People often use other terms that are very near or very close to kin to strategic corruption, such as kleptocracy or an earlier term, state capture. And you're probably wondering, I mean, why do we need this term at all? And why should we use it if we have a sort of a hybrid threats as a sort of general sort of term, and then when we have many other terms that have been used lately, such as foreign interference, corrosive capital, hybrid warfare, and the ongoing securitization. So what's the added value of using the term strategic corruption when many of us remember that we have talked so much about corruption in the past 30 years since it became a topic? I say this deliberately, since it became a topic, because you could say that corruption was always, in a way, a topic when a political party is running for power, or when a group of political actors wants to, act and overthrow a dictator or whoever. One of the first arguments for doing so is that the person in charge is corrupt, meaning that it produces waste, meaning that it produces fraud. And this idea of fraud was something, for example, in the 1990s, that drove the World Bank and many other international actors in promoting and elevating corruption to a stance that it didn't previously have in global political space. The idea that global governance may improve countries, the idea that global governance will allow us to make good governance a principle in every country, which will reduce waste coming from financial aid, the idea that legal reforms which will support development, a better developed economy, was something that really led and that pushed corruption to become a primary policy problem, a problem to be solved. So strategic corruption came very late to this game and came very late into this discourse and becomes a topic and becomes a theme only in the last few years. Actually, the term was, you could say, coined in 2020 when it was first used by Philip Zelikow and some other U.S. Think tanks and policy leaders as a response to what was seen as corruption-driven foreign interference, primarily by authoritarian states such as Russia and China, into democracies. So strategic corruption differs from what you could call ordinary corruption, in it that the culprit is not necessarily the policymaker in charge, the stakeholder, or the leading political class, political caste of one country. Rather, it always has a certain cross-border element, where corrupt practices by state actors are used to advance geopolitical objectives. So corruption here does not come as fraud, does not come as policy failure. It may manifest itself in such a way. But the primarily idea is that strategic corruption is a weapon used deliberately by state actors to advance geopolitical objectives, usually and most likely in another country. So the origin of the concept, as I have said, comes from the US policy think tanks, and the first operationalization in terms of policies that would prevent strategic corruption was something that we saw when the Biden administration enacted the U.S. strategy on countering corruption, which was the first to declare corruption as a national security threat. We see in this change that sort of is paradigmatic. So no longer is politics or economics the center stage for anti-corruption activities. Rather, it is the idea that the state may be captured by foreign actors, something that gains prominence in this approach. And with this logically comes the idea that corruption should now be seen as a national security threat. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the response that was initially set out by the European Union and the US and the UK in sanctioning Russian oligarchs was actually driven, I think, much by this thinking of strategic corruption. The idea was basically this, that Putin rules through oligarchs, but these oligarchs are not merely people who, embezzle money because they support the government and because they have certain technocratic skills and connections. Rather, these people may also act offensively. Their business deals through their transnational companies may often be used to influence political options in different states and in different countries, thereby actually acting through this offensive corruption, through interfere in foreign countries and be kind of hybrid warfare agents, and find those who would be involved in what we traditionally would call treason in order to betray their countries and act primarily in sort of Russia's interest. Well, this was not just the set of policies that was to be launched by the strategy on countering corruption, was not just limited to Russian oligarchs and to seizing of their property and the freezing of their assets and sanctioning, in many instances, the members of their family. Rather, it was a wide approach that was focused also on prevention of money laundering, on mobilization that each country enables and creates beneficial owners, registries of beneficial owners of companies, that each country looks at political financing and transparency of political financing in a more sort of serious way in order to make legal loopholes less present. And it was informed, this approach, by some previous cases, such as the cases of Azerbaijan, the so-called Azerbaijani laundromat, which was the action that was to bribe members of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe with the goal of suppressing criticism of the Aliyev government and buying legitimacy in international institutions that were to hold it accountable. So the concept of strategic corruption as such was developed and partially was developed by U.S. think tanks and partially implemented by the Biden administration. I would also say by the UK. administration in some way through in its strategies on prevention of serious fraud and kleptocracy. Rather, the difference being that the UK felt that the term kleptocracy would better suit them in focusing on it, which we are not sure that is the correct approach, because I mean kleptocracy, when you think about it, is not something that would adequately describe what's going on in many democratic countries. Not in all, perhaps, but in many democratic countries. Rather, we believe that the term strategic corruption, because kleptocracy always sort of is the idea that those who rule steal, and steal on a grand scale. This is not necessarily so in the concept of strategic corruption, as I will explain later. So currently in the literature, we see the focus of the authors writing on the concept and trying to develop the concept, people such as myself, people such as Joseph Boschgai and Oksana Hus that will talk to you in the panels later. We see this focus on authoritarian states, most likely Russia and China, which are seen as the sort of countries of origin of strategic corruption, countries that carry out these cross-border hybrid warfare, foreign interference action through corrupt means, where the United States and other democratic states are seen as targets. However, competing understandings tell us that it's not just weaponization of bribery against democracies that is something that how strategic corruption as a concept can be understood. It is also a wider framing of malign authoritarian influence. And this, again, what you could see in this is a sort of confusion in terms. Also, not just malign authoritarian influence, but, for example, the idea that bribery is a tool that great powers use, be they democracies or be they autocracies, is a tool that they use for influence, foreign influence peddling. So this tells us basically that the literature itself now, as it's being developed, struggles with various understandings of strategic corruption. What was initially developed to describe this offensive of Russia and China primarily against the West is now seen also as something that is a discursive power and a Western rhetorical instrument that serves to justify securitization and curtail transparency in doings. So these competing framings that exist in this time tell us basically that there is also great interest in the concept, and that these struggling understandings challenge and mobilize reviewers and writers to write on the concept and try to develop it further. I think, however, that when you say the term strategic corruption, it's not very difficult, so to say, to sell and difficult to explain to the population and the practitioners working in the national security sector. When you look at Central Europe and when you look at Balkans and when you look at the sort of traditions in the energy industry, you will see very strong connections, for example, with the usage of energy as a strategic instrument. And you will see that much of it has already been for years and years recognized as a tool of Russian influence. So the pricing and the various agreements done with Gazprom, pipeline routing and political loyalties have often led to political capture as the outcome and dependency on energy as instrument. This is something that we have seen in Bulgaria. This is something that's unraveling now in Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is something that partially fueled certain instances in political developments in Hungary. So a slow alignment of political interest with foreign strategic objectives over the years is something that strategic corruption as a concept is useful in describing. And the reason why we got it now was, and why these practical terms are used is because the tide has changed. Whereas in the 90s and the early 21st century, the idea that we in the West, if we can call ourselves that, are exporting anti-corruption to the global South, to the East, was completely true. And indeed, anti-corruption policies have been very successful, whether you think of whistleblower legislation, whether you think of various rule of law reforms, the creation, for example, of judicial independence and such models, they have been successful as an export, as sort of legal and political goods of export. So they have traveled well. They've been implemented and sold across the world. But now it seems that the tide is changing. We are faced with a geopolitical offensive through corrupt means. And this is why strategic corruption appeared as a concept. However, it is not, in my view, a mistake to look at what has happened also in the US lately and what has happened in some other countries. And to use this as an example that unfortunately also in the West now we see some tendencies that can be described as strategic corruption. It is easy to bash, on Moldova and on people like Elon Shore and some other Moldavian oligarchs who have been involved in various bank frauds in the past decade, with the support of Russia and with the support, with some of the ultimate goal being supporting the Russian-oriented political parties there. But when you try to talk about, for example, why we have seen the dismantling of much of anti-corruption elements and tools in the US in the past year or two, we see much less criticism and much less people willing to talk about this. You could say it's an American problem, but it faces all of us, not just because America is big, but because we should admit that much of what was done in the field of anti-corruption was done by the US and with the strongly supporting others. Now, when we see that USAID anti-corruption programming has been gutted, that inspector generals in some agencies have been fired, and when decades of transnational enforcement architecture, primarily to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, has been removed, we are looking at a country that is offering itself to strategic corruption, that is offering itself to various lobbyists. Certain particular aspects of U.S. federal criminal law also speak on behalf of this, because while other countries have been tightening anti-corruption criminal law provisions in the past 20 years, the U.S. has been slowly actually dismantling them, which is why it is arguably easier there to trade in interests. To get into the conflict of interest, but conflict of interest that is unmitigated. You can easily get into conflict of interest also in many other jurisdictions. That it will be mitigated, at least in democracies, by a body working on this. So my point is we are approaching the concept in a very risky time when the fashion of the time does not seem to be that anti-corruption is cool and that we should engage it and the rule of law reforms are meaningful. Rather, the unstated pressure on the policymakers here is we can now stop imitating U.S. anti-corruption reforms. They are doing so well for themselves, and they are actually so much engaged in creating various, not necessarily in being corrupt, but in creating various opportunities for corruption. That it's actually easier for them, that it's actually easier for policymakers in Europe not to be the only ones who are now pushing for anti-corruption reforms. My idea, and the idea of people who have invited me to speak at this event, is that we should not follow this fashion. My idea, rather, is that the concept of strategic corruption has outlasted the consensus that produced it. And that while they are exploiting many different opportunities in the United States to engage in strategic corruption, that this is an example that should not be followed. Rather, we should try to develop a strong and robust policy response that would curtail legal responses. That would strengthen the legal responses, because much of, for example, illicit political finance schemes today exploit legal gaps and not violations of law. Still, the very idea that you should treat corruption as a national security threat comes with various risks. And I'm the first to admit this, so I'm aware that what we are arguing for may be understood as something that leads to very strong securitization. We have seen an example of this, for example, in Romania in the late 2024 presidential elections, or was it early 2025, when we had a candidate who partially, through violation of political finance laws, exploited many ads on TikTok in order to get ahead for the elections. And in an overreaction, in my view, the Constitutional Court of Romania suspended the elections, citing foreign interference and national security threats based on the assessments produced by the Romanian National Security Agency. However, that got us into many other problems. So the security framing can be legitimate and can be a mechanism through which domestic actors securitize political inconvenience, but operating under different mandates and oversight mechanisms, they create various overlaps with the regulatory procedure of parliamentary and democratic oversight. So what we're doing is we are walking a fine line here between the job of intelligence agencies and the job of all other actors who are, for example, regulatory agencies monitoring the media, regulatory agencies monitoring political financing, that are not per se national security institutions. So in building this legal architecture and in building a more robust policy response, we will be taking actually great risks. And this is something that we need to be aware of. I believe that the Nest Institute and the work that it's trying to produce in proposing policy outcomes for reduction and management of strategic corruption within Slovakia is very important, as it's a crucial first step that could also be implemented in various and proposed for various other European jurisdictions, and that this more coherent policy approach will have its criticizers, will have its doubts, and will produce its mistakes. But it's the option that it's a step that we must take, and it's a step in the right direction towards management of foreign interference in this sense. I thank you for this opportunity to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to questions also during the panel session. So I will now return the word to the speaker and presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hogić, and thank you for your keynote. Now we just need to reconnect for the first panel, so I ask the speakers and the moderator of the first panel to come to join us, and we'll have maybe 3 or 4 minutes short, quick break, so we just adjust the Zoom call, and we'll start approximately in 5 minutes. Thank you.